Welcome to the garden question and answer video that we do on Sundays. You can ask gardening questions down in the comment section below this video, and that's where we pick from each week. 22 written down for this week, and I think there were some more beyond that as well. So maybe there'll be a midweek question and answer video at some point. We try to pick the ones that are kind of most relevant to the timing, you know, overwintering and things like that we'd be doing now. There's some pansy questions and other things that are kind of seasonal. The questions that we try to pick from just to make these Q&As relevant to when you're watching them. Let's see, a few things before we get started on that. I mentioned that all the t-shirts are $5 off. So if you go to the store at HortTube.com, you add a t-shirt to the cart, you won't see the price is $5 off until you get over to the cart and you're about to pay, and you'll see it takes $5 off per t-shirt when you do that. So it'll take it off automatically, and you'll see that before you pay that it's been taken off. The Pollinator Paradise shirt is new. We have a new ACA shirt. Train's talking over here. You guys can always hear the train in the background on our gardening videos here. A new ACA shirt on a dark blue background. A new Maple Enthusiast shirt as well. So 3 new shirts have been added in the last week or two. And so I mentioned the t-shirts are $5 off. For the entire month, the rest of the month of November and all of December, both the weekly garden planner and the Learn to Garden video series are going to be $60 off. So big savings on those. I think it's the biggest amount we've taken off of those. If you're buying the weekly garden planner, it's just 60 weekly is the code. And if you're buying the Learn to Garden video series, it's 60 weekly. Learn to Garden video series is just as it sounds. It's a series of videos that we continue to work on and add to on teaching all the basics of gardening. And the weekly garden planner is just as it sounds. It's a weekly garden planner. It's got a video at the beginning to kind of tell you how to adjust it to your area just a bit. And we're going to have some other people participating in that, I hope, pretty soon as well for different areas of the country. So both of those are going to continue to expand. Once you own them, you own them. And what else am I missing? The consultations for January and February are also $10 off, and the code is on the screen for that. Okay, but get past the salesman-y part of this, but we have everything in the store on the website basically discounted for if you want to give one of those things as a gift. Thank you for considering that. Okay, all right. So I always talk about synthetic fertilizer. You know, they're talking about, I've said in the past that sometimes you need to use synthetic fertilizer in containers instead because the organic fertilizers don't necessarily work as well in containers as it does in the ground, because you don't have necessarily all the life in there to break the fertilizer down and make it available. And, you know, containers get extremely dry, they get extremely hot, they get extremely cold. And so a lot of the beneficial fungi, beneficial bacteria relationships that these plants might have in the ground, they aren't necessarily going to have in the container, depending on, you know, whether the container's in the full sun or shade, whatever. So I have said in the past that maybe I'll use synthetic fertilizer in the containers. That is especially true. And then the other part of this was they were talking about using flower tone on their violas and pansies in containers. It kind of doubles up this time of year, because once it gets cold, the things that are required to break that organic fertilizer down and put it into an available form are really kind of going dormant, you know, when it's this cold. They're not as active. So even more so this time of year, I would probably use a synthetic fertilizer if I was container planting pansies and violas and that kind of thing. But again, you know, you guys all know that I'm all in on organic fertilizers. It's just, there are occasionally things that we do in our ornamental gardening that don't really relate to, you know, the real world of, you know, of a wooded area or a pasture or a grasslands or anything like that. We're putting something in a container, isolating it in there, and then putting the roots on that plant through extremes during seasonal changes and that kind of thing. So that's where synthetic fertilizer could be necessarily. Make sure you're using a controlled release synthetic fertilizer so that, you know, the nutrients aren't leaching out of the bottom of the container as much, and the plant's actually being able to utilize them. And you can get special pansy fertilizer, and I've shown that in the past on videos from the old house when I did more pansies, when I planted more in the ground, that there are very specific pansy fertilizers that you can use as well. But again, we do prefer organic fertilizers. It's just in the winter time, if you're actually trying to get something to grow, a little difficult with organic fertilizers. Okay, this person's in El Paso and they want a tree selection for their high desert space. They probably have a high pH soil as well. We were at the Japanese maple event and there was a gentleman named Caden from Western Oklahoma. They kind of, Sunshine Farm and Nursery, they kind of specialize in trees for difficult spaces and high chalky soils and desert conditions, and they literally put trees through the worst conditions possible, and then a lot of their tree selecting ends up out in public spaces in very difficult places where trees can't be watered, and you know, they're that kind of thing. I don't think they sell directly to the public, but they probably will know somebody in West Texas that buys trees from them. You can follow them. I don't think they have a website, but you can follow them on Facebook at Sunshine Farm and Nursery, Western Oklahoma. Caden's super, super nice. He spoke at that event, and I immediately got up with Mark Wethington to ask, see if we could get Caden possibly to speak at the plant symposium here in Raleigh for woody plants in 2027. Super, super interesting. Nursery that's been, again, selecting for, in like the worst possible seasonal rain, 8.5 pH conditions for just like, you know, these trees that have to really, really, really be tough. So I think that would be a good contact for you. And then again, they may not sell directly to you, but they may sell to somebody in West Texas. Okay, this person wants to plant a chase tree or vitex. There's a vitex directly behind the palm that's behind me back here on a small slope with an oak with root competition. They're considering building a low, dry, stacked retaining wall. So I guess making some sort of little wall that's, you know, evens out the slope a bit. And filling it with soil, is this reasonable? Yeah, you can absolutely do that. You're not going to hurt the oak probably by taking one little small space and making a low retaining wall. I don't know that it's absolutely necessary. I mean, the vitex are really, really tough plants. It's the reason you need to talk about Texas. You know, you see a ton of vitex grown in the Dallas, Austin, Fort Worth area. They're just tough plants. So I don't know that you necessarily need to go out of your way as much as you think you do, but you do need to make sure you're watering it when you're, you know, for a while, because you got tough conditions on a slope. It's going to be drier, plus you have root competition, which, you know, the oak is going to try to steal, you know, from the new tree. So you can do this dry stack wall thing if you want to. For me, I'd probably just plant the thing in the slope and move on with my day, and just know that for the first couple years it's in the ground, you may have to give it some additional water, but it will ultimately compete with anything. I mean, that tough plants. I mean, really, really, really tough plants. And we don't live in a tough area, but we see them in very, very tough areas and tough places. This person said their tree service said he wouldn't recommend pine bark as a mulch because of fire. They attract fire ants, but would recommend hardwood in Georgia Zone 8B. Is this true? I don't think the pine bark attracts fire ants. I just think it's easier for them to displace the pine bark than it is the kind of layered hardwood mulch. That hardwood mulch makes kind of a thick, kind of a shell on the top of it, if you've used it before, and I just think it's a harder material for the ants to work in, and that bark is not. And I've talked a lot about pine bark over the years floating, and so it moves around the bed during heavy rains and that kind of thing. And I just think it's easier for them to move it to do this. Lawn is the if you want a recommendation for something not to have fire ants, it's lawn. I mean, that's the main places they like, especially places that warm up early in the morning and then are shaded in the afternoon. If you have one of those east-facing slopes in the turf, man, that's the kind of places they actually absolutely love. But they will get into beds as well, and I do see it more in pine bark, and I also see it with people who have used landscape fabric. They love spaces where landscape fabric has been disturbed for some reason. I think it prevents the water from getting through as easily. So keep that in mind. If you use landscape fabric, it's another negative for weed control fabric. It's another negative, is that fire ants tend, if you have fire ants in your area, they tend to like it in that material. But again, I don't think it attracts them. It's easier to work in for the ants. It doesn't fall back in the hole as they're doing their thing, because it's, you know, fairly chunky. Okay, so this person's battling Gnostic, this slimy green fungus they believe came in on their tires, and it's now all over their driveway. So I'm assuming your driveway stays moist. Must be in probably in a shady space or something, or doesn't necessarily have to be a shady space. That stuff will actually take full sun, but it has to stay moist pretty consistently. So this stuff is, it's this slimy goo like material. You'll see it in plant nurseries everywhere. Every plant nurseryman that's watching me right now or has a garden center knows this material well. It tends to grow on the side of the beds, loves the nitrogen runoff from the containers. It actually is a nitrogen fixing material, but this is a photosynthetic bacteria. So it's not an algae. It looks like an algae, but it's actually a bacteria that can photosynthesize. There's theories around this goo like material that it is actually what was responsible for oxygenating our atmosphere. Yay to this, yay that it is around, but it's able to fix nitrogen into the soil, and I think that's why it's a lot of times in nursery situations. It's a very tough material to get rid of, but I think the main thing is it needs to be dry in between. The reason we see it in nurseries, and it's this slippery mess, it's really, you can slip and fall on it very easily if you have a nursery with this material, this gooey material, algae looking material that grows along the edge of the beds. It'll grow in greenhouses and just kind of, it's really, it's a gooey material. That's a pain, but it's the problem with getting rid of it in a nursery is number one, we're giving it plenty of nitrogen, and number two, it stays moist consistently. So really about your driveway would be how to figure out how to get it dry in between rains and watering. I don't know if it's too low. I don't know what the material is your driveway's made out of. You know, I don't know if it's gravel, you know, you can put another layer of gravel, whatever. I don't really know how to deal with it in a home. Never really had it in a home situation, because most of our home situations, we're not irrigating the same as we are in greenhouses and in a nursery situation. But it's a material, it's a living thing I'm quite familiar with, because it is, you know, you're just walking like this at the nursery, trying not to fall down, sliding on this material, but it's also an interesting material at the same time, or an interesting living thing at the same time. Okay, is deadheading a viable and reliable way to redirect energy into vegetative growth across most genera? So yes, you know, when we cut back, you know, when you tip prune something, you know, and slow the process down of that thing trying to flower or whatever, it does allow that plant to divert energy. It's like when I talked about moving a plant and you're cutting some of the roots. You know, if we cut some of the top to kind of put it back in balance when we're moving it, it allows that plant to redirect energy back into rebuilding those roots we damaged. So yes, it's pretty well known that most plants can be tip pruned. There's exceptions to that. I don't think you'd want to prune the flower bud out of an agave that was only going to flower once in its life. You know, there are exceptions to that. You wouldn't want to top a pine tree necessarily. Some pines you can, but others you can't. You know, so there are plants, and so it's not every genera of plants are going to benefit from that type of pruning. But most of the thing we have for ornamental horticulture, you know, if I bring home an azalea that's in full bloom and plant it in the ground while it's in full bloom, it's really hard for that plant to do all of the things we're asking it to do, to continue to bloom, to put on its spring growth, to root in the ground, all those kinds of things. So, you know, a little bit of, if you just take the flowers off of it, take the flower buds off of something, it will put energy back into what it needs to. But most people aren't going to do this. Most people aren't going to bring a hydrangea home that's in full bloom and then take the flowers off. So that's what I've always said in the past. Enjoy the flowers as a container plant, and then put it in the ground after that. And then the plant can direct its energy to growth root growth and not top growth initially when you're putting something in the ground. But an interesting question, but definitely not every genera I'm going to go start hacking on. Every kind of plant am I going to go start hacking on. Some don't like it as much as others. This person has not great soil, Georgia red clay. Would you recommend fertilizing pansies and other flowering plants? So I don't fertilize as much. This question came from, they watch this channel and I talk about how little I fertilize, but that's because I've improved the soil so much, right? And this person's saying their soil has not been improved. Should they fertilize more? I think that's really, again, fertilize through observation. I can't state this enough. I mean, if you put something in the ground and it's doing okay, and you can't expect to put something in the ground in April and then in July look at it and go, yeah, I did it. Everything's going perfect with that plant. It's going to take a minute for things to establish themselves. But as long as they're not going backwards and they're not, if things look okay in the garden, you don't need to be dumping fertilizer on it constantly. You don't need to dump extra fertilizer on it. You can just do the once a year general organic fertilizer thing that I do, or nothing if things are going well. The nice thing about that Georgia red clay is, as hard as it is for you to believe, because it's such a pain to go out there and dig holes in it and work in it, it has great nutrient content. And if you're planting things up a bit so that they're not drowning in it, they have access to put their roots down into what is really a high quality soil or nutrient, a lot of nutrient content and water holding capacity and proper pH. I mean, your pH is probably 5.5 or something, which is probably perfect for a lot of the things you're planting. So again, I consider, the red clay is problematic for people, but not some problematic for the plants, as long as they're being mounded a little bit in it so that they're not, this deep in that Georgia red clay. So fertilize through observation. The answer is maybe. Maybe you need some additional fertilizer. But if things are going well, I'm just not going to do it. I'm looking around out here. I never refertilized my vegetable garden this year. We put a small amount of organic fertilizer on it in March, late February or early March. My vegetable garden wasn't even planted until April 20th, and then went the entire season without ever being fertilized again. And it just never missed a beat. Now, that doesn't mean I'd never fertilize it. If I was observing it and I was like, man, it just seems like my vegetables are lagging behind where they normally are. They're not flowering as well. They're not producing as well. Then I would have refertilized them. So that's the answer. Do observation before you jump in and try to manipulate it in some way. Okay. This person says they make their own seed starting mix, but could only find Miracle Grow with fertilizer, with Miracle Grow with fertilizer added to it. And this is not a thing about Miracle Grow. It's just about all these bagged products now have fertilizer in them, whether it's Miracle Grow or whatever it is. I'm not a big fan of it. I'd like to go and buy materials that don't have fertilizer already added to them, and then again fertilize them based on observation. And the seed has everything it needs. It doesn't need fertilizer until it's up and has a few true leaves, and then at that point I usually give it some fish emulsion or some sort of organic fertilizer that's really not pushing them all that much. Because keep in mind, most things, this is not true with everything, again, you can't say all genera for anything, but most plants, when they germinate from seed, will sit there, they'll put on a couple true leaves, and then they'll just kind of sit there for a while and not do a heck of a lot of growing. Annuals are different. Annuals can pop out of the ground in the spring and really get to growing pretty quick because they only have that one season to seed themselves. But most things come up, they take a rest minute, they root out into the ground, and then they take off from there. They kind of store energy. And so most things don't want you just to go germinate and grow, immediately start growing. They kind of want to go through a period of time of rooting out into that soil media, and that kind of thing. So we just use, again, like some fish emulsion and water. When we water them, they're getting a tiny bit of fertilizer. So I don't want it in the seed starting mix, but it's becoming harder and harder to avoid. These companies seem to have bought the companies that make the materials, or they're starting their own, you know, operations bagging materials, and they just want their names all over everything. And so, but no, it's not my favorite to start off with a fertilizer in there. I also worry sometimes that the fertilizer sat in that bag for a long time and it's been in the full sun, maybe in that parking lot, wrapped in plastic, and is that fertilizer like melted, it's broken down, it's going to release too quickly, you know, it's not going to age well in that bag in the middle of a parking lot on a 90-degree day. So again, it's not my favorite, but it seems to me more and more, you know, what we run into is it harder and harder to buy materials that don't already contain fertilizer. Okay, plus or minus of using pine needles to mulch there in the redwoods area of California. We were just there a few weeks ago. Pine needles are perfectly fine mulch. I've loaded more pine straw. The garden center I worked at as a kid, and then the landscape company I went to work for before I started my own landscape business. Man, we had apartment buildings all over Raleigh, and you know, getting tractor trailer loads of pine straw in January and February and March, and just, you know, entire apartment complexes of pine straw. And then I loaded thousands and thousands and thousands of bales, tens of thousands of bales of pine straw as a teenager at a garden center in Raleigh. So got a lot of familiarity with pine straw. I don't like it for a soil building material. You'll notice when a pine needle drops off the tree, it's this big, and then you just watch it kind of shrink down to basically nothing pretty quickly. There's a lot of water content in it, and so it tends to break down pretty quickly in the soil, and or if you have a pine forest, can end up way too thick. I mean, there's two different extremes of this that I've seen. It's not my favorite material, but I did use pine straw rotating back and forth. I've mentioned this a few times at the old house. When I thought my hardwood mulch was getting a little too thick, I would use the pine straw, which breathes pretty well, to supplement like every third or fourth time I mulched. And it allowed my hardwood mulch to break down a little bit better before I redid it. So I was just trying not to ever have my hardwood mulch end up too thick. So that was my strategy using pine straw. It's easier to cover area. You can just take these two bales and, you know, throw them where you want them to ultimately spread them, and then spread them pretty quick. I can definitely spread pine straw much faster than I can hardwood mulch. But again, I don't think that it builds soil as well, but it's a perfectly fine, but it covers all the bases of regulates moisture, regulates soil temperature, hopefully does some weed control, all those kinds of things. It checks every box except for it doesn't build a humus layer, you know, a organic layer between that existing soil and your mulch as fast. Okay, would that be what I would say? But if it's the material you have, definitely use it. How much sun can Japanese maples take during the day? They're in 8A Atlanta. They bought an orangeola and a waterfall. I have an orangeola sitting over here. Those are really, so you're in zone 8A Atlanta. Those are really fine textured Japanese maples. You know, the foliage on those is going to probably burn more in full sun in your area. By the time you get to like Longwood has a beautiful waterfall Japanese maple over a retaining wall. I showed it in a presentation a couple weeks ago. Just the perfect use for a waterfall Japanese maple. And it's in the absolute full sun in the middle of a field at Longwood Nursery. And it had just a tiny bit of burn on it, but they're way north of where you are. I think you'll end up with a little bit more burn on them. If you're trying to put Japanese maples in the full sun in Atlanta or further south than that, you really need to look at some of the hybrid maples, that hot blonde maple that I have here, that Sunseeker series or something that Mr. Maple has, and then just do some research on it. Our Twomley's Red Sentinel that's back here, you know, will take full sun a little bit better in the Atlanta area. So I would look for ones that have been, and maybe join a Facebook group for Japanese maples possibly, and ask, you know, what people have the most success with in full sun in the South, and variety shop that way. But definitely these super fine textured dissectums like orangeola or waterfall, are probably more likely to burn in all-day sun in Atlanta than some of the others. Okay. So then somebody said, what's the difference between winter and summer sun? Deciduous trees in a combo of shade and sun in the summertime, and then full sun in the winter. So the sun is on a much lower angle. Weirdly, we're closer to the sun in the wintertime, if you guys remember this from school. We're further from it in the summer, but the angle of the northern hemisphere is in line with the sun, so we're getting slammed directly in the summertime. But then we're actually closer to the sun in the wintertime, but we're angled away. We're angled away from it instead of into it, or that way. Yeah, that's what I meant. We're angled away from it. So the sun is at an angle like this in the wintertime, where it's at an angle like that in the summertime. So it just doesn't matter. It doesn't matter if your shade stuff all that much is in the full sun in the wintertime, with some exceptions. I mean, some plants don't like to have frost on them in the morning and then the sun come up on them immediately. You know, that icy covering on the top of that leaf. They're just not adapted to it. Probably didn't come from an area where this was a phenomenon. And that sun can hit that ice formation on the top of that leaf and cause a little bit of damage on it. So there are probably some plants that aren't going to like this as much, but most plants don't care. The sun's just on a lower angle. They're not growing, they're dormant. No big deal. But again, there's some plants that probably can, I think camellias sometimes can be susceptible to that early morning winter sun with frost on the leaves, getting a little bit of damage from that. Let's see, this person is 7B, New York City. They bought a dwarf paniculata. It has 6 hours of sun, has great flowers on it, but in late summer it flops. They prune it down in the winter every year. So two things, 6 hours of sun is that's the bare minimum for a Hydrangea paniculata probably to be full and compact. That's probably, and I don't know what time of day the 6 hours is. If you're counting 7 a.m. to 1 p.m., that 6 to 9 in the morning is irrelevant. Or if you're telling me it's 2 to 9 o'clock at night or 3 till 9 o'clock at night, that's also, that late day sun is not going to be adequate for it. So I would imagine that like 2 or 3 of these 6 hours are not very good there because the sun is on a different angle at that time of day. I think you're not quite getting enough sun. The way to compensate for this is when it flushes out in the spring. You cut it down in the winter like you always have. When it flushes out in the spring, grows about a foot and a half, I just tip prune it just a bit at that point. It will delay the flowers a little later in the summer, but it'll probably create some lower branching and keep the plant overall smaller that summer. And maybe that will prevent some of that flopping, but I don't think you're getting quite enough sun on it as part of the issue. But a second pruning, I think, will help with that. This person's in Dallas, Texas, removed a pecan tree because of storm damage. It shaded 18 to 20 Japanese, I don't know if this is 15 to 20 Japanese maples or a 15 to 20 foot Japanese maple. I think it's a 15 to 20 foot Japanese maple, which then scorched the top half of the tree branches. Can they simply remove the top half of the tree? And when? You know, I would wait for this to flush back out next year and see how it's going to adapt. I don't know what Japanese maple this is. It is Dallas, so you're probably, I don't know how this tree is going to respond. But a well-established older tree like this may be able to adapt quite a bit more than you think it's going to adapt. So I'm probably not going to do anything on this tree until it leaves back out in the spring and determine actually what got actual damage. So the scorching of the leaves doesn't mean the stems have died. So I just wait for it to flush back out in the spring. It's going to do fine in the spring of next year. And then if you need to cut anything that actually died out of it, I do it at that time, and then live with it there for a summer and see what it's actually going to do before you get drastic about it. Because again, sometimes old established plants can surprise us. What will happen here though is this plant's probably going to need some additional water than it's needed in the past from you. So you may, water's going to leave the top of that plant much quicker next summer than it did in the past. So you may need to water it a little bit more and then see what it does. You know, you don't know until you know, right? In terms of trying to put some temporary shade over it. I think it'd be very difficult for a 15 or 20 foot tree to have additional shade on it. But just this is a wait and see for me. You're not going to kill it next year by leaving it out in the full sun. It's just going to look bad. If it's going to look bad, maybe it's not. But it's not. It's unlikely it's going to kill it. This person loved the Schmidt tree video. They want to special order some trees. Is there a chance that their local nursery will special order because of their high minimums? So some nurseries do have quite high minimums, but they're shipping from Oregon to, let's say, Raleigh, North Carolina here. So they're, you know, a plant. I don't think you're going to see as many plants in container plants from that Oregon nursery end up in your garden center in Raleigh, North Carolina, just because there is going to be a high shipping minimum and a ton of freight shipping a finished plant. What is going to end up here, though, from Schmidt is their bare root operation. So they do a giant, most of the trees there are done bare root. They'll dig them in the wintertime, store them. It was part of that video if you want to check out that video. And then they ship those bundles of graded trees to nurseries, and it's a much less expensive shipping operation with no soil on them, right? They weigh a lot less. They ship them to nurseries. The nurseries container plant them and grow them out in containers in our area rather than shipping that soil all the way across the country. And so as an example, like we did a 50 ornamental tree video. That entire video was shot at Panther Creek Nursery in Johnston County, another wholesale nursery, just like Schmidt Nursery. But I'm sure that Panther Creek, in all likelihood, buys trees from Schmidt. Very confident they do, because several of the trees that were in that video that are Schmidt, ones that Schmidt's actually introduced, are at Panther Creek. So our local garden centers here, you know, Homewood, Fairview, whatever, doesn't matter which one you go to. They can order from Panther Creek. So you can still get these Schmidt trees. It's just done differently to save the freight shipping it across the country. Bare root's just much better. And Panther Creek does a great job of growing the trees out from bare root trees. So you can still get the trees. It's just more, my point in that video about asking your garden center for interesting trees was just, let's just keep asking garden centers for interesting trees. So we're not planting the same 20 trees out everywhere. There's a lot of other material, and Panther Creek's one of those nurseries that does that. Literally, we shot 50 different ornamental trees in a single morning in that video that came out months ago. If you want to look that up, 50 flowering trees or 50 ornamental trees, look that up on the channel. That video, every one of those trees you see there was from one nursery here in Johnston County. This person has green, gray, black caterpillars with brown heads eating their Mugo pines. That's a European Sawfly, and so that one's become a bit of an issue. I think it can also attack Scotch pines, Austrian pines, which we have all of the above in this garden, but we haven't seen them here yet. They tend to eat the old needles. They don't mess with, there's a moth that will get the new foliage on them and stop the new foliage, but the European Sawfly caterpillar tends to eat the old needles. So what it does is it makes the older part of the stem a little thinner than it would be, but it doesn't actually overall hurt the plant. So for me, I just don't, I'm not going to go out and spray these things. I'll knock them off into some sort of container and drown them or something like that. That my strategy is completely pick them off and move on with your day, and know that you're probably going to get some damage from them. You're going to miss a couple, but yeah, that's what I would do on them. That's the European Sawfly. It's a real pain, and eats the old needles. And some other pines it'll jump on if it has to. You know, there's that thing happening too. So walked around the Ralston with Mark Wethington this few days ago, and we were looking at Calicarpa has crepe myrtle bark scale. So they took out taking out crepe myrtles to protect the fantasy crepe myrtles that are at the Ralston. And, you know, people are making decisions on whether to take out crepe myrtles because of crepe myrtle bark scale if they're getting it badly. Unfortunately, it's now on 2 other genera. So this insect may not be done with us as and this is the same thing with, there's been other insects like this over the years. We had a flea beetle that was in my nursery initially only on Itea, our native Itea, Virginica, and I was like, man, we got an insect that only eats Itea. What is this? And so I was starting to try to figure it out, and other nurserymen, it was showing up in their nurseries as well, and it was like, only Itea? Why does this thing like Itea so much? And the next thing you know, it was on everything. Not everything, but almost everything. And this thing overnights in the containers. It's not really a landscape problem as much as it is a container plant nursery problem. They live in the potting medium, and they're not out during the day. They come out at night, chew on the leaves, and then hide during the day. It's really difficult to control an insect that's hiding in the soil. You have to either spray them in the evening while they're out active, or do some sort of really much tougher chemical operation. It's been a terrible insect. My point about that is you get these, insects that come along like this, and you go, oh, this thing only attacks this. And then it turns out, well, if it needs to, it will jump to something else. It doesn't have to have that one particular plant. This person has old style hydrangeas. I'm guessing that means Hydrangea macrophylla's big mop head hydrangeas, I'm guessing, is what they're saying by old style. With many spent blooms, can they prune them off? They do little pruning, but can they prune these off? Yeah, if they're unattractive to you, you can prune them off. We prune them off of ours. Just prune them right under the flower cluster, okay? So Hydrangea macrophyllas like this probably already have the flower buds on this, the bud is on the edge of the stems for next year, or where your flower buds already are for next year. So don't go hacking down into the plant at all, or it will cost you flowers next year. But you can cut right under the flower cluster without doing any damage. You'll see, if you look under it and follow down the stem a bit, you'll see where next year's bud is on the edge of that stem. I just don't cut those off. This person has a Kanjiro Camellia sasanqua, very common one, very, very common sasanqua. Leaning too much, how to prune it to make it more upright and win. So if you were gonna prune it, you'd prune it in the late winter, early spring. You can really go after them hard. They take several years. They can take several years to recover. I had a neighbor cut some down during the pandemic. Kind of like big, giant Camellia sasanquas down to like 3 feet tall, and I was sure he killed them. But they're beautiful today. It took about 2 years for them to look normal again. So yeah, you can do that. And then they also asked, can they be espaliered? Yes, absolutely. Camellia sasanquas are really good candidates for growing flat against a wall or some sort of structure. Really good candidates for that. I like slightly slow growing plants for that, so that I only have to once or twice a year get out there and try to espalier them or grow them flat on something. If it's something that continually grows, or vines or something like that, you go to the beach, you miss a couple weeks, and the thing just takes over in some way, and it's really hard to kind of reset it. But something like a camellia that really only flushes heavily like once a year gives you that opportunity to flush, and then you can attach it to the wall however you need to, prune off things that you don't want to keep, and you're just kind of done for the season. So makes camellias perfect candidates for espalier. This person has a Camellia sasanqua that keeps getting black spots. Has morning sun, afternoon shade. They tried to spray neem oil and that seems to work, but any other options? I think you may need to move this camellia to some space that it dries out a little bit more. If they stay moist, too long into the morning, you may end up with some black spots, especially some of the older varieties. So in the breeding for some of the newer varieties that's been selected from, but even they can get some black spotting on the leaves if they're in deep shade areas where the air doesn't move as much, if there's other things against them and that kind of thing. But for me, if one's having an issue like this, if it doesn't look so bad that it just doesn't matter, then leave it alone. If it bothers you enough or looks bad enough that you're worried about it, I'll move it once and try that, and if that doesn't work, it's out of there. That would be my thoughts on that. This person has mangave with pups on it. what's the best way to take them off and repot? So when you start to get those pups on mangave or agave or anything, you'll get the pup first and then they'll typically root a bit. So once the pup has its own roots on it, that's when I would break them off or cut them off and repot them. You can do it without that, but then you'd need to root them. It's much easier if the thing's on its own roots a little bit. But you could do that kind of anytime that you see one. I mean, don't do it on a 95-degree day out in the full sun on your asphalt driveway, you know what I mean? Be reasonable about it. If it's hot or cold, you know, adapt to that. Do it inside if it's cold, do it outside, you know, do it, you know, in the evening or the morning if it's the summertime and it's a hot time of year. But pretty much any time of the year that you have. Some agave, you know, just live century plants, you know, they're more like decade plants. They bloom and just die, and then some offset, we call it, and develop little pups. Some of the the mangave and agave do this. So, you know, you can, some do and some don't. But you can just take the piece off when it has roots. That's the easiest way to do it. Okay, this person's in Zone 8, upstate South Carolina. Planted 2 Western Arborvitae, so that would be Thuja placata is the Western Arborvitae, in harsh afternoon sun and morning shade. Now, seasonally more shade. They're turning brown and looking bad. Is it a lack of sun or transplant shock? That I don't know without seeing it, obviously, but I would imagine it was really dry toward the end of summer and early fall here in South Carolina, North Carolina, a lot of places actually. And so I would imagine that, you know, I've always talked about that conifers get that interior thinning in the fall. It's kind of normal. If it gets excessive, that means they were dry going into it. And so likely it is just transplant shock. The shade thing won't show up as browning. It will likely show up as a thin stretched plant in the future, you know, where it just seems a bit floppy and doesn't seem to be able to stay as a really compact, that compact habit that we buy these for. So I think the shade thing would show up more in the future. The browning would show up because of it being dry at some point. That's my guess. This person's in Apex, Zone 8A. They bought an automatic thermometer for their plastic greenhouse. What is a good setting to keep plants asleep in the cool, yet not die? Most cold sensitive plant is bougainvillea. So bougainvillea is pretty, you know, it probably doesn't like many temperatures below 50 really, but I mean, it won't hurt them. So I'm probably gonna set it to like 45 degrees, something like that would be my temperature where I could keep things asleep and keep the bougainvillea probably from having any problems. So maybe 44, something like that. Your biggest issue is going to be in your plastic greenhouse during the day that you need to be opening it up. If it's above freezing, you definitely need to be opening it up. I think if you keep it at 45 degrees at night and then it's able to get to 85 during the day, well, that's spring and things are gonna try to grow. So make sure you're allowing it to be cool during the day. It's one of the big things. And, you know, if you go up, a lot of the nurseries in the Northeast are, you know, mostly plastic, but most every day people go and open those doors on them, and they're just trying to keep them warm at night. They're not trying to keep them super, super warm during the day, because that may fool them into waking up. But I'd keep it, if you could do 40, I'd probably do 40 even. Really am trying to keep it cool at night without having anything freeze. I just don't want to hurt the bougainvillea. So 42 or something like that, but then open it up during the day. Okay. This person has potted herbs in Zone 8B in Georgia. Would they survive the winter in a pot? They want them doing pot to pot and then mound leaves and mulch around them. So a mix on potted herbs, right? Basil's an annual. And then there are some that would be cold sensitive, like rosemary, you know, is Zone 8 probably, or 7B. And then other ones that are Zone 5 hardy probably, and just aren't going to have an issue. So that's a mixed group when you just say potted herbs, because some are going to be adapted to very cold temperatures. The one thing, though, that almost all of them have in common is they're mostly Mediterranean plants. I mean, it's Greek oregano and thyme and rosemary, and these things are typically, and salvia officinalis, are Mediterranean plants, and they don't want to stay wet in the wintertime. So I think I would put them pot to pot, like you said, but I'd be super careful mounding leaves. You can mound leaves around the containers, but I would not put that over top of the containers. Your biggest enemy in the winter is going to be less about cold and more about water. So if you were to pile a big pile of leaves over the top of them, it almost certainly keep them too wet. So if you put them pot to pot someplace, I would flip something upside down underneath them, like a tray from an annual tray or something like that, or something that will allow water to get out of the bottom of the containers and not sit flush on the ground, because otherwise the water may not get out of the bottom of the pots when it rains. So again, your biggest enemy is actually water, not necessarily cold. But yeah, put them pot to pot somewhere and try to get them as dry as possible in between rains and waterings, so that they don't drown during the winter time. So that was 22 questions. Thank you guys again. Again, everything is on sale over on the website. There's a code on the screen right now. You can see there's a code for getting the discount on the consultations, a code for getting $60 off either the Learn to Garden video series or the weekly garden planner, and the $5 on the t-shirts just comes off automatically in the shopping process. Thank you guys for watching.